I watched a three-star general walk past my father like he was invisible, cross an entire military auditorium, and stop 3 feet from where I stood, hidden in the back corner among the cleaning staff. That was the moment my family's 20-year lie shattered into 1,000 pieces. My name is Emma Whitmore, and for 2 decades I let my father believe I was a failure, a dropout, a desk clerk shuffling papers in some forgotten Washington office. He told everyone I couldn't hack it at the Naval Academy, that I ran away when training got hard. He said these things at family dinners, at backyard barbecues, at church gatherings where neighbors nodded sympathetically at the shame of having a quitter for a daughter. And I never corrected him, because the truth was classified at the highest levels of the United States military. The truth involved authorization codes that could start wars or prevent them. The truth meant that while my father mocked me for being weak, I was actually signing orders that deployed carrier strike groups to hostile waters. But that Tuesday afternoon at Naval Base Coronado changed everything. My younger brother Tyler was graduating from SEAL training, and my father made sure I knew exactly where I belonged in the family hierarchy. He handed the gate guard our VIP passes and pointed at me with his thumb, telling them I was just a helper they brought along to carry bags. He suggested they seat me in the back with the civilians, maybe near the service doors. The young Marine at the checkpoint recognized me immediately. I saw it in his eyes, but I gave him a subtle signal to stand down, and he let my father's insult hang in the air unchallenged. Inside the ceremony hall, I was pushed to the furthest corner while my parents took front row seats. My father turned around one last time before it started and hissed that I should keep my head down, that I shouldn't embarrass Tyler in front of his teammates. Then General Marcus Webb took the stage, and I knew the charade was about to end. The humiliation actually started 3 days earlier, on a scorching afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina, at the house where I grew up. My father, Frank Whitmore, was hosting one of his legendary backyard gatherings. The air was thick with hickory smoke and the smell of charred meat. Red Solo cups sweated condensation onto checkered tablecloths, and his old Army buddies sat in lawn chairs, swapping stories about deployments that happened before I was born. My mother moved between the kitchen and the porch, refilling chip bowls and pretending everything was normal. I was standing at the grill, turning ribs with a pair of tongs, sweat rolling down my temples. Frank gestured toward me with his beer bottle, and I heard him loud and clear even over the classic rock blasting from the portable speakers. He told his friends I didn't amount to anything in the Navy, that I couldn't handle the pressure and washed out. He said I was just a glorified secretary now, fetching coffee and filing paperwork in some government building. Then he pointed across the yard at Tyler, who was leaning against the porch railing in his dress whites, the SEAL trident gleaming on his chest like a beacon. Frank announced that Tyler was the only real warrior in the Whitmore family, the only one who carried his blood properly. He said Tyler did what his older sister couldn't do, that Tyler didn't run when the training got difficult. I bit down on my tongue so hard I tasted copper. My hands kept flipping ribs like nothing was wrong, but inside I was calculating how many more hours I had to endure this before I could escape back to my real life, the life Frank knew nothing about. During dinner, he escalated. He pulled out his old bronze star from a worn velvet box and placed it on the table right next to my plate of mashed potatoes. He told me to pick it up, to feel what real honor was like. He said it was something a dropout who fled the academy would never understand. My fingers brushed against the cold metal. My heart didn't clench with shame, though. It tightened with a weary kind of pity. I had a dozen of those medals locked in a high-security vault at the Pentagon. I had commendations signed by presidents. I had strategic planning awards that didn't even have public names because the operations they referenced were still classified. But Frank didn't know any of that. To him, I was just the daughter who disappointed him. Then my secure phone vibrated in my blazer pocket. The rhythm was specific, urgent. Emergency protocol. I excused myself, saying I had to take a work call. Frank laughed and told me to go ahead, that my boss was probably wondering where his donuts were. I walked away from the porch lights and into the shadows of the hallway. My posture changed instantly. The tired daughter disappeared. Vice Admiral Emma Whitmore took her place. The voice on the encrypted line was Colonel Hayes from the 5th Fleet. They had visual contact with a hostile vessel in the Gulf. They needed my direct authorization to engage if the situation escalated. I gave the order clearly, no hesitation. Maintain defensive posture, but if they cross the line, open fire. Don't let them breach the perimeter. I hung up and took a breath. When I walked back into the dining room, Frank was still laughing at some old war story. He glanced at me with paternal contempt, completely unaware that I had just authorized a combat operation thousands of miles away. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its faded wallpaper and old track trophies, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how much longer I could maintain this double life. The answer came 2 days later when Frank announced we were all going to Tyler's graduation ceremony. He said it would be good for me to see what a real military career looked like. I didn't start out invisible. When I was 17, I was the girl who ran 5 miles before school and studied calculus until midnight. I was the one Frank bragged about at the VFW hall, telling anyone who'd listen that his daughter was headed to Annapolis. He had my acceptance letter framed on the living room wall. But something shifted during my plebe summer at the Naval Academy. I excelled too quickly. My tactical assessments caught the attention of senior officers who pulled me aside and asked questions that didn't have obvious answers. By my sophomore year, I wasn't just studying naval strategy, I was being recruited for intelligence work that didn't officially exist. They told me I had a gift for seeing patterns others missed. They said my mind worked 3 moves ahead, that I could anticipate enemy movements like a chess master reading an opponent's tells. By my junior year, I was being briefed on operations that weren't in any textbook. When I graduated, there was no big ceremony for me. No dress whites and proud family photos. Instead, I was pulled into a classified briefing room and told that my career would require absolute discretion. My work would save lives, but no one could know about it. Not my friends, not my family, especially not my family. Frank took my absence at graduation as abandonment. He told everyone I dropped out that I couldn't handle the pressure. When I tried to visit home that first Christmas, he barely looked at me. He had already rewritten history in his mind, and I was cast as the failure who broke his heart. I tried to tell him once. We were sitting on the back porch, just the 2 of us, and I started to explain that I was still serving, that my work was just different than he imagined. But he cut me off before I could finish. He said he didn't want to hear excuses, that winners don't need to explain themselves. So I stopped trying. Over the years, I rose through ranks that Frank didn't know existed. I coordinated operations in 7 different theaters. I sat in situation rooms during international crises. I briefed senators and cabinet members. My security clearance was so high that even mentioning my job title required being in a skiff. But at family gatherings, I was just Emma, the disappointment, the one who couldn't measure up. Tyler was different. He joined the Navy at 22 and announced from the beginning that he wanted to be a SEAL. Frank practically glowed with pride. He started wearing SEAL-themed shirts and hats, even though Tyler hadn't made it through training yet. He posted constantly on social media about his warrior son. Tyler and I had been close once. When we were kids, I taught him how to swim in the murky creek behind our house. I helped him with his homework and covered for him when he snuck out to see his high school girlfriend. But as we got older and Frank's favoritism became more pronounced, something fractured between us. Tyler never defended me. When Frank made his cutting remarks at the dinner table, Tyler just looked down at his plate. I didn't blame him exactly. He was caught between loyalty to his sister and the desperate need for our father's approval. In the end, approval won. The breaking point happened last Christmas. Frank gave Tyler a vintage combat knife that had belonged to our grandfather. He presented it in front of the whole extended family, making a speech about how it should go to a real warrior, someone who understood sacrifice. I was standing right there, still in my civilian clothes, holding a glass of wine and pretending the words didn't land like physical blows. Later that night, my mother found me in the kitchen. She touched my shoulder and whispered that she knew I was doing important work, even if she didn't understand what it was. I asked her why she never said anything to Frank. She just shook her head sadly and told me that some men need their illusions to survive. Frank's whole identity was built on being the alpha male, the military hero who raised military children. If he had to accept that his daughter outranked him in every measurable way, it would destroy something fundamental in him. So we all protected his ego. My mother through her silence, Tyler through his acceptance of unearned praise, and me through my absence and my secrets. But that protection was about to end, whether I wanted it to or not. Living 2 lives simultaneously is exhausting in ways most people can't imagine. During the week, I was Vice Admiral Whitmore. I wore my uniform with 4 stars on the shoulder boards. I walked the Pentagon corridors where junior officers stepped aside and saluted. I sat in classified briefings where the fate of ships and sailors rested on my decisions. My assistant kept my calendar organized in 15-minute blocks, and every morning started with a threat assessment that could determine if we were moving toward war or peace. But on weekends, when I visited Charleston, I was just Emma, the disappointment. The woman who brought potato salad to family gatherings and stood quietly in corners while Frank held court. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. On Friday afternoon, I might be coordinating a carrier strike group's movements in the South China Sea. By Saturday morning, I'd be in my mother's kitchen, listening to Frank complain that I never made anything of myself. I kept a separate phone just for family calls. My real work happened on secure devices that required fingerprint and retinal scans to unlock. I maintained a small apartment in Charleston under my name, but my actual residence was a secure facility near the Pentagon that didn't appear on any public records. The lies became second nature. When Frank asked what I did at work, I told him I processed paperwork and made copies. When my mother asked why I couldn't visit more often, I blamed budget cuts and a demanding boss, not the fact that I was sometimes coordinating operations in 3 time zones simultaneously. Tyler's SEAL training complicated everything. He didn't know that the tactical scenarios he practiced were often based on mission plans I had personally approved. The underwater demolition exercises he struggled through used protocols I had helped refine. The intelligence briefings he received were filtered through my office. There was bitter irony in Frank praising Tyler for achievements that were only possible because of infrastructure I had helped build, but I couldn't say anything. National security isn't negotiable just because your feelings are hurt. The night of that barbecue, after I authorized the combat operation from my childhood hallway, I sat in my old bedroom and stared at my secure phone. The screen glowed in the darkness, showing encrypted messages from the Fifth Fleet. The hostile vessel had turned away. No shots were fired. Crisis averted. My civilian phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. He was asking if I was coming to his graduation ceremony, and he wanted to know if I could help with logistics. He treated me like an assistant, someone useful for carrying bags and booking hotel rooms. I almost told him the truth right then. I almost sent back a message explaining that I wasn't just attending his ceremony, I was the reason his ceremony was possible. But I deleted the draft and just replied that I'd be there. 2 days later, Frank called with his plan. He had secured VIP passes for himself and my mother. He said I could come along too, but I shouldn't expect special treatment. He made it clear that this was Tyler's day, and I was only invited as a courtesy. I could have told him right then. I could have explained that I didn't need his VIP passes because I could access any part of that base with a single phone call. I could have mentioned that General Webb, who would be presiding over the ceremony, had personally requested my presence at a planning meeting the week before. But I didn't. Some part of me wanted to see how far Frank would take his delusion. Some part of me needed to know if there was any limit to his contempt. When we arrived at the base checkpoint, Frank was in his element. He wore his old Army veteran cap and a shirt with an American flag patch. He chatted with the gate guards like they were old friends, name-dropping military terms he half remembered from his own service 40 years ago. The Marine corporal checking IDs looked at our documents and then looked at me. His eyes widened slightly. He had seen my face in briefings, on official communications, in photographs that accompanied strategic directives. He knew exactly who I was. Frank didn't notice. He was too busy explaining our VIP status and pointing out Tyler's name on the graduation roster. Then he gestured toward me and told the corporal I was just a helper, that I should probably be seated somewhere in the back with the civilian staff. I caught the corporal's eye and gave the smallest shake of my head. "Stand down. Let it play out." He nodded almost imperceptibly, his face carefully neutral, and waved us through. The base housing area looked exactly like every other military installation I'd visited in my career. Identical buildings painted in neutral colors, geometric lawns maintained with precision. American flags snapping in the California wind, but this time I wasn't here as Vice Admiral Whitmore touring facilities and inspecting readiness. I was here as Emma, the family disappointment, following her father toward what he assumed would be his moment of glory. We checked into a hotel near the base. Frank spent the evening in the lobby bar, holding court with other SEAL families. He wore his veteran status like armor, trading stories about his single deployment to Germany in the 80s as if it was equivalent to modern combat operations. I sat in my hotel room and answered secure emails. There was a situation developing in the Eastern Mediterranean that required my attention. An intelligence asset had gone dark, and we needed to determine if it was a communications failure or something worse. I coordinated with 3 different agencies, authorized a reconnaissance flight, and approved emergency extraction protocols. My mother knocked on my door around 10. She sat on the edge of my bed and twisted her wedding ring the way she always did when she was nervous. She told me she wished things were different, that she wished Frank could see me for who I really was. I asked her if she had any idea what I actually did for work. She admitted she didn't, but she knew it was important, because I carried myself differently when I thought no one was watching. She said sometimes, late at night, when I visited and thought everyone was asleep, she'd see me on the back porch talking on my phone in a voice that didn't sound anything like the daughter she raised. I wanted to tell her everything right then. I wanted to explain that the daughter she raised had become one of the highest-ranking women in the United States military. But the words caught in my throat, tangled up with 20 years of practiced secrecy. She hugged me and left. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, working through classified reports and trying not to think about the ceremony tomorrow. Morning came too fast. Frank was insufferable at breakfast, lecturing Tyler about proper protocol and telling stories about his own boot camp experience that had been embellished beyond recognition. Tyler looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, the weight of Frank's expectations visible on his shoulders. We dressed in our civilian best. Frank wore a suit he'd bought specifically for this occasion. My mother put on a dress she'd been saving. I chose simple black slacks and a navy blazer, professional but unremarkable. The drive to the base was tense. Frank kept coaching Tyler on how to stand, how to salute, how to represent the family name. Tyler just nodded, his jaw tight. When we arrived at the ceremony hall, Frank's VIP passes got us through several checkpoints. Each time, he made a show of explaining our connection to Tyler, emphasizing his son's achievement while casually mentioning my own lack of military success. The young service members at each checkpoint looked at me with varying degrees of recognition. Some were too junior to know my face. Others clearly did, but followed my subtle signals to remain quiet. I was playing a dangerous game, letting Frank dig himself deeper and deeper into a hole he didn't know existed. Inside the auditorium, an event coordinator directed us to our seats. Frank and my mother were escorted to the front row, prime positions with a clear view of the stage. When the coordinator looked at me questioningly, Frank interrupted before she could speak. He explained that I wasn't really military family, just someone who used to know Tyler. He suggested seating me in the back, maybe near the exit doors so I could leave early if I needed to. He said it with a smile, like he was doing everyone a favor by managing expectations. The coordinator's eyes flickered with confusion, but she followed his directions. She led me to the very last row, a corner seat partially obscured by a support column. From here, I could barely see the stage. Frank walked past me one final time before taking his front row seat. He leaned down and whispered that I should stay quiet during the ceremony, that I shouldn't do anything to embarrass Tyler in front of his SEAL brothers. He said the back of the room was where I belonged, in the shadows where failures go. I sat down and pulled out my personal phone. There were messages from colleagues at the Pentagon asking if I'd be available for a crisis briefing tomorrow. There was a note from my executive officer asking about strategic priorities for the coming quarter. And there was one message from General Webb himself sent 30 minutes ago. It simply said, "Looking forward to seeing you this afternoon, Admiral. Time to set some things straight." I put my phone away and looked across the crowded auditorium toward the front row where Frank sat, chest puffed out with pride, completely unaware that his entire worldview was about to shatter. The auditorium filled slowly, deliberately. I watched from my back row corner as families found their seats. Mothers dabbed at their eyes with tissues before the ceremony even started. Fathers sat rigid with pride, many of them veterans themselves, understanding the weight of what their sons had accomplished. Siblings clutched programs and phones, ready to capture every moment. Tyler's graduating class filed in through a side entrance. 200 newly minted Navy SEALs, their dress whites crisp and perfect, their faces young but carrying something ancient in their eyes. They had survived training that breaks most men. They had earned the right to wear the trident. I spotted Tyler in the formation. His shoulders were straight, his expression focused. For a moment, I forgot about Frank's cruelty and felt genuine pride in my brother. Whatever his faults, whatever complicated dynamics existed in our family, Tyler had achieved something real. He had pushed through pain and doubt and exhaustion. He deserved this moment. Frank, from his front row seat, was practically vibrating with excitement. He kept turning to tell the people around him about Tyler, pointing out which one was his son, explaining the family legacy of military service. He carefully edited that legacy to exclude me entirely. The lights dimmed slightly, an honor guard posted the colors. The audience rose for the national anthem, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that always came when I heard those opening notes. 20 years of service, and it still got me every time. When we sat back down, General Marcus Webb walked onto the stage. He was a legend in the special operations community. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. He had personally led raids that took out high-value targets and rescued hostages from impossible situations. His chest full of medals represented operations most civilians would never know about. He was also someone I had worked with directly on multiple occasions. We had sat in the same situation rooms. We had coordinated strikes and planned evacuations. We had shared the burden of decisions that meant life or death for operators in the field. Webb stepped up to the podium and surveyed the audience. His gaze was methodical, taking in the room section by section. When his eyes reached the back corner where I sat, partially hidden by the support column, they stopped. I saw the moment he recognized me. His eyebrows rose slightly. Then his jaw tightened with something that looked like anger, though I knew it wasn't directed at me. He began his speech with the standard remarks about dedication and sacrifice. He talked about the SEAL ethos and the commitment these young men had made. But his delivery was distracted, and he kept glancing toward the back of the room. After about 5 minutes of formal remarks, Webb paused. He looked down at his notes, then pushed them aside. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It carried a different weight. He talked about the invisible infrastructure that made special operations possible. He mentioned the intelligence analysts who worked through the night. He praised the logistical coordinators who ensured teams had what they needed. And then he said something that made my heart stop. He said that the most important people in the military were often the ones no one knew about. The strategists who prevented wars instead of fighting them. The planners who saw the battlefield 3 moves ahead. The leaders who carried the weight of classified decisions in silence. Frank was nodding along in the front row, assuming Webb was building towards some point about Tyler and his graduating class. Then Webb stepped away from the podium. He descended the 3 steps from the stage slowly, deliberately. Every eye in the auditorium followed him. The honor guard at attention near the flags didn't move, but I could see them tracking Webb's movement from their peripheral vision. He started walking up the center aisle. Frank stood up, his hand already extending for a shake, a smile splitting his face. This was it. This was his moment. The general was coming to acknowledge him, to thank him for raising such a fine son. Webb walked past Frank like he was a ghost. He didn't even glance down. Frank's hand hung in the air, his smile frozen. Confusion starting to cloud his expression. My mother put her hand on his arm, but he shook her off, turning to watch Webb continue up the aisle. The general walked with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. 200 SEALs and 400 family members held their breath. Webb reached my row. He stopped. He turned to face me directly. General Webb's voice carried across the entire auditorium without needing amplification. He told everyone present that it was a profound honor to have Vice Admiral Emma Whitmore in attendance. He said he hadn't expected to find the Pentagon's most brilliant strategic mind standing in the overflow section among civilian staff. His tone made it clear this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately put me there. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. 200 Navy SEALs rose to their feet as one. The sound of their boots hitting the floor was like thunder. They stood at rigid attention, their hands snapping into perfect salutes, their voices joining in unison to greet me with the respect my rank demanded. The families in the audience turned in their seats, trying to see who the general was addressing. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Tyler's face went pale, his eyes wide with dawning realization. Frank stood frozen in the front row. I watched the color drain from his face, watched understanding hit him like a physical blow. His veteran cap slipped from his trembling fingers and fell to the floor. Webb wasn't done. He continued speaking, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. He explained that I was the architect behind many of the strategic operations that kept hostile forces at bay. He mentioned that the tactical packages these new SEALs would rely on in the field had been personally approved by me. He said that the intelligence networks, the supply chains, the communication protocols, all of it passed through my office. Then he delivered the kill shot. He told Frank directly that if it wasn't for the operational maps I had authorized 3 weeks ago, Tyler probably wouldn't have survived the most dangerous phase of his training: the live fire exercises, the combat scenarios, the risk assessments that kept training accidents from becoming training fatalities. I had signed off on all of it. I stood up from my corner seat. I stepped out from behind the support column. Every eye in that auditorium was on me, and for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't hiding. Webb continued, explaining that I had commanded operations across 7 theaters. He listed accomplishments that were technically declassified, but that most people in that room didn't have the security clearance to fully understand. He mentioned presidential briefings and joint chief consultations. He said I was being considered for a 4th star. Tyler was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The other SEALs in his graduating class were looking between me and him, connecting the dots, realizing that their teammate's supposedly failed sister was actually one of the most powerful people in the Navy. Frank finally found his voice. He tried to speak, tried to say something, but the words came out as a strangled sound that died in his throat. His entire worldview was collapsing in real time. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment of public humiliation, all of it was being replayed in his mind with the knowledge of who I actually was. Webb asked someone to bring me a proper seat in the front row. An event coordinator rushed to place a chair next to my mother, who was crying now, her hands shaking as she reached for me. As I walked down that center aisle, passing row after row of stunned faces, I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 decades. Not vindication exactly, not revenge, but something like freedom. The weight of secrecy lifting. The exhaustion of maintaining 2 separate lives finally ending. When I reached the front, Frank was still standing, still frozen in shock. I looked at him directly for the first time without the burden of hiding who I was. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked at him with steady, calm eyes that had seen far more than he could imagine. My mother hugged me fiercely, whispering apologies into my shoulder. Tyler stood with his SEAL brothers, and I could see tears streaming down his face. Not tears of embarrassment, but something deeper, something like grief for the years we lost. The ceremony continued, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. When Tyler received his trident, when they pinned that gold insignia to his chest, the applause was strong. But everyone in that room knew the real story now. They knew that the quiet woman who had been relegated to the back corner was the one who made moments like this possible. After the ceremony ended, families flooded the floor to congratulate their graduates. I stayed in my seat, watching the chaos unfold. Frank hadn't moved. He was still standing in the aisle, looking at me with an expression that cycled through shame, disbelief, and something that might have been the early stages of understanding. General Webb approached me before he left. He shook my hand with genuine warmth and told me he was sorry it took so long for my family to see what the entire military had known for years. He said I deserved better. I thanked him and meant it. But part of me wondered if this public revelation was really what I wanted, or if I had preferred the privacy of my secret. There was power in being underestimated. There was freedom in being invisible. But there was no going back now. The truth was out, and we would all have to live with the consequences. The drive back to Charleston was silent. Frank sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. My mother kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, her eyes red from crying. Tyler was in the car behind us, driving separately with some of his teammates, probably trying to process everything that had happened. When we pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, Frank got out without a word and walked straight to the back porch. He sat in his old chair, the one he always claimed at family gatherings, and pulled out a bottle of expensive whiskey from somewhere inside the house. My mother touched my shoulder and asked me to give him time. She went inside to start unpacking, leaving me alone with the man who had spent 2 decades tearing me down. I could have walked away, I could have driven back to my hotel, flown back to Washington, and let the chips fall where they may. But something made me walk to that porch. Something made me sit in the chair next to his. Frank poured 2 glasses without asking. His hands were shaking badly enough that amber liquid sloshed over the rim. He pushed one toward me and drank his own in a single swallow. He started talking without looking at me. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet evening air, every word landed clearly. He told me he had spent 20 years convincing himself I was a failure because he couldn't accept the alternative. He said he needed me to be small so he could feel big. He admitted he burned my letters, the ones I sent from Annapolis, the ones where I tried to explain that my path was just different. He threw them away unread because the return address didn't match the story he wanted to believe. He talked about his own military service, how it was the defining achievement of his life, how he had built his entire identity around those few years in uniform. When I graduated from the Naval Academy and immediately disappeared into classified work, it challenged everything he understood about himself. If his daughter could surpass him so completely, what did that say about his own accomplishments? So he rewrote history. He told himself and everyone else that I had failed, that I had run away. It was easier than admitting his daughter had become something he could never be. The shame in his voice was absolute. He called himself a coward. He said he had hidden behind my grace, using my silence and my secrets as permission to diminish me. He told me that every time he mocked me, every time he pointed to Tyler as the real warrior, he knew he was lying. Deep down, in a place he couldn't admit, he knew I was extraordinary. The tears came then, violent, shaking sobs from a man who had held his shame for decades. He apologized over and over, his words breaking apart into incoherent sounds of grief. I put my hand on his shoulder. I told him I didn't need him to see the Vice Admiral. I just needed him to see his daughter. The healing didn't happen overnight. It couldn't. 20 years of damage doesn't disappear because of one conversation and a bottle of whiskey. But that evening marked a shift. Something fundamental broke open between us, and the truth finally had room to breathe. Tyler arrived late that night. He knocked on my hotel door at midnight, still in his dress whites, his eyes red and swollen. He told me he was sorry. He said he knew he should have defended me at those family dinners, should have questioned Frank's narrative, should have been a better brother. I told him the truth, that I didn't blame him. He was caught in an impossible situation, trying to earn approval from a father who only knew how to love through competition and comparison. We talked until dawn. I explained what I could about my work, the parts that weren't classified. He asked smart questions and listened with an intensity that reminded me of the little brother I used to know before Frank's favoritism drove a wedge between us. By the time the sun came up over the Charleston harbor, something had been repaired. Not completely, not perfectly, but the fracture between us had started to knit back together. The following Sunday, Frank did something unprecedented. At church, when people asked about Tyler's graduation, he told them the real story. He said his daughter was the true hero of the Whitmore family. He admitted he had been wrong about me for years. He stood in front of his community and dismantled the lie he had built. My mother told me later that it cost him something to do that. Pride isn't easy to swallow, especially for men of Frank's generation, but he did it anyway. I returned to Washington the following week. My desk was covered with classified briefings and strategic reports. The world kept turning, and crises didn't pause for personal revelations. But something felt different. The weight I had carried was lighter now. A month later, Frank called me. Not to ask for anything, not to make demands, just to hear my voice. He asked about my day, and when I gave him a vague answer about meetings and paperwork, he didn't press for details. He understood now that some things couldn't be shared. At the end of the call, he told me he loved me. He said it awkwardly, like the words felt foreign in his mouth. But he said it. Tyler and I started talking regularly. He told me about his first deployment, and I listened with the unique understanding of someone who had authorized the mission parameters that would keep him safe. I couldn't tell him that, but I knew it, and it brought me a strange comfort. The story of what happened at Tyler's graduation ceremony spread through military circles. People who had known me for years, but never knew my family context, reached out with messages of support. Some of them shared their own stories of family members who didn't understand or respect their service. I realized I wasn't alone in this. There were countless people living double lives, maintaining facades for families who couldn't or wouldn't see them. Some by necessity, like me, others by choice, protecting themselves from judgment or disappointment. 6 months after Coronado, I got my 4th star. The ceremony was small and private, held in a Pentagon conference room with only essential personnel present. But Frank was there, and Tyler, and my mother. When they pinned those stars to my shoulders, Frank saluted me. It was regulation perfect, the muscle memory of his youth returning, but his eyes were wet, And when he lowered his hand, he mouthed 2 words. "I'm sorry." I nodded. Acceptance, not forgiveness, because forgiveness suggests the debt is paid, and some wounds don't work that way. But acceptance means we could move forward. We could build something new on the ruins of what was lost. Now, when I sit at family dinners, the dynamic is different. Frank doesn't lecture. Tyler doesn't bask in unearned praise. My mother doesn't have to mediate between competing egos. We eat together. We talk about normal things. And when my secure phone rings, interrupting our meal, Frank doesn't make jokes about donuts and coffee. He just nods and tells me to take my time. He says the call must be important if they're interrupting dinner. And then he waits patiently, sometimes for hours, for me to finish handling whatever crisis has emerged somewhere in the world. I'm writing this from my office in the Pentagon. Outside my window, the Virginia sky is turning that particular shade of purple that comes just before dusk. My desk is cluttered with reports that will influence decisions made by people more powerful than me. The weight of responsibility never gets lighter, but I've learned to carry it better. To everyone who's listened to this story, who's followed me through the pain and the revelation and the tentative healing that came after, thank you. Your presence here means something. It means these stories matter. It means the invisible people doing invisible work aren't quite so alone. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're listening from. And if this story resonated with you, if you've got your own version of a family who couldn't see you, share it. Not because misery loves company, but because truth deserves witnesses. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. I've got more stories to tell, more truths to unpack, and I want you here for all of them. Emma Whitmore, Vice Admiral, United States Navy. Finally at peace with who I am and where I come from. Finally home.